situation which I've learned a lot more about in the 2 days that I've been here. And it's a very interesting time, and your centre is playing a very significant role. So this is... No. So this is what I'm planning to do. First of all, I want to begin by examining the principles and practices of presidential term limits. Then I want to explore some of the arguments for and against term limits with you, hopefully. Identify some of the principal contexts in which ideas about term limits are raised, and then use those points to reflect on some wider themes for comparative constitutional law and term limits. The idea of globalization and localization, regionalization and judicialization. So let's see how we go. Let's just spend a little bit of time thinking about the ambit of what we're talking about here. I'm going to be only talking about term limits in systems with an executive president, including perhaps systems with a semi-presidential system, but not parliamentary systems. I will come back to that contrast in due course, but we're primarily talking about systems where the president has a lot of power. We're talking about democracies, whether they're established democracies or democracies in transition, not talking about authoritarian or one-party systems, although the issue of term limits can be relevant there as well, as we see in the discussion presently going on in the People's Republic of China. And I'm going to take the idea of term limits to include the length of a presidential term, the number of terms for which a president can be elected, and whether those limits apply to consecutive terms or only to consecutive terms or more generally. And of course, the question of term limits is just part of a larger constitutional system everywhere, where there will either be checks and balances, other checks and balances on the president, or there won't be. And the question of the effectiveness of the checks and balances is obviously an issue in Indonesia as well. Now, let's talk a little bit about the patterns of presidential systems and term limits. There are at least 40 full presidential systems in democracies around the world. It's one of the main alternatives for setting up a system of government in a democracy. If we look across presidential systems, we see the length of presidential terms generally varies between about 4 or 7 years. It's very common for presidents to be limited to 2 consecutive terms. Apparently, the most common formulation is a limit to 2 consecutive 5-year terms, putting the present Indonesian provisions right in the mainstream in that regard. It's also quite common for presidential systems not to have formal legal limitations on the terms for which a president serves, which doesn't mean that the president isn't limited in practice, but there's some variability in that regard. And there's some countries, of which the Philippines is an example, and the Republic of Korea is another, which limit the president to 1 term. Generally, that's quite a long term, for example, 7 years, I think, in one of those systems. But nevertheless, that's a variation on the theme. And apparently in those countries, it's a reaction against the abuse of power by presidents in the past. And of course, some countries only prescribe consecutive terms. In other words, you can't have more than 2 terms in a row, but they allow the same person to run for office again if there's been an interval in between. And we saw Vladimir Putin doing that some years ago with consequences that we now can see. Now, the issue of term limits for a presidency arises in a whole range of contexts. Most obviously, they arise when a new constitution is being made or significantly amended. So that's the point at which the term limits were inserted in the Indonesian constitution. But the issue may also arise where an attempt is made to remove or extend term limits in an existing constitution, or the issue may arise where there's ambiguity or controversy about the rules. For example, there's quite often a question arises about whether if the president served a term before the new rules about term limits came into effect, whether that earlier term counts as the term limits or not. And sometimes considerations protecting presidential term limits in various ways. For example, some country, I can't remember which one it is now, that in the presidential oath, they require the president to take an oath to respect term limits. And to give you an example of another kind, sometimes the consideration is given to other ways of limiting the electoral advantage of an incumbent president, for example, requiring the president to resign from office once the election is called, even if he or she is then running for another term. And that's an unusual arrangement applied in Madagascar. So why do we emphasize term limits in presidential systems? Just see, hold on. Term limits are sometimes discussed and they sometimes exist in parliamentary systems as well. And some prime ministers hold office for a very long periods of time, suggesting that term limits might be appropriate. So the lesser emphasis on term limits in parliamentary systems, I think, can be explained on two bases, but we should discuss this when it comes to discussion time. There's less of a need for this kind of limitation on power in a parliamentary system for reasons we'll come back to. And I think it would also be more complicated to impose term limits in a parliamentary system where you might be limiting the term of someone to run for a constituency, or you might be saying, well, even if you do get elected, you can't be prime minister. It's much more straightforward in the presidential system. You can just say you can't run for office for more than 2 terms, and that's the end of it. So in order to substantiate those points, I've got a slide here outlining what seems to me to be the typical characteristics of a presidential system, but you probably understand those better than I do. So again, we can come back to that discussion. Most obviously, the president is directly elected, and for that reason, the president has considerable democratic legitimacy in his or her own right, and that then affects the design of other parts of the system. The president is also head of state, and very often also formally at least the commander-in-chief. The president has a fixed term, can't be removed, subject to the usually difficult process of impeachment. The president may have very considerable constitutional powers in his or her own right, including some powers of a legislative nature, power to make decrees, for example, in some circumstances. The president has access to considerable fiscal resources and other mechanisms for state patronage. The president has a high profile just because he or she is president and can exert significant influence on all segments of society as a result. The ministers and other advisors are at least formally subordinate to the president. And in many presidential systems, parts of the bureaucracy, quite large parts of the bureaucracy, change as the president changes. And maybe there are other characteristics that you can all identify as well. Compare parliamentary systems to all that. In a parliamentary system, and I live in a parliamentary system, so I speak from some knowledge, a prime minister derives legitimacy from the support of the legislature, not from a popular vote. There's usually a separate head of state, and the separate head of state maybe that is likely to be the commander-in-chief. A prime minister depends on the legislature to continue in office. Term of the prime minister can usually be ended simply by a vote in the parliament. The prime minister is usually a member of the legislature and regularly answerable to it. For example, our prime minister is in parliament every day when it's sitting and is peppered with questions and so on. In these circumstances, there's inevitably some idea that the Prime Minister needs to act in a way that keeps the support of the legislative majority and the rest of the ministry. And so we quite often say the Prime Minister is the first amongst equals in the cabinet. He's not the elected person to whom the others are accountable. He is just another elected person amongst the rest of the ministry. And usually most of the public service is likely to be permanent in a parliamentary system, although that also is changing. And again, you may have other points to add to that list. So against that background, what are the arguments in favour of presidential term? And that's the question you asked me to speak about. You can tell me if I'm running out of time. Just stop me. Well, one answer, the most obvious answer, is that the office is so powerful that if the terms aren't limited, there's a danger that a president who's repeatedly chosen will ultimately lead to the erosion of democracy, lead to authoritarianism, lead to forms of dictatorship. And this might be for several reasons. It might be because the office is such a powerful office that it attracts the wrong people in the first place. It attracts people who just want a lot of power in the state. Or it might be that it attracts the right people, but the temptation of being elected again and again to this powerful office gives the individual who holds the office temptation to keep going. And in that sense, sort of undermines their good intentions in the first place. So that argument about where multiple terms leads is one of the most powerful, and I think it's the one you were suggesting when you opened the seminar. But there are other reasons as well. Term limits encourage political competition between candidates, either within the governing party or between political groupings, and that's more healthy for democracy than having the same person in office for long periods on end. Term limits are a way of introducing not just new candidates, but new ideas, as well as new people into a democratic system. I mean, businesses believe in a turnover of people at the head of the business. Why wouldn't we think the same way in a democratic system? The alternation of power that term limits encourages helps to build a democratic culture and to build experience with democratic practice, build experience with the idea that there are different people at the top of the state. And I think that's important in any democracy, but it's particularly important in transitioning to democracy as the struggle is to really bed down a democratic culture. And term limits may be important for stability and even for peace in societies where there's latent or even actual or even latent political conflict. Different groups vying for power, the idea that the term of one group is limited and that another group can take over can be very important for stopping armed conflict. And for these reasons, we sometimes find term limits for presidents as requirements in peace agreements, and Burundi is an example. Now, in all fairness, we need also to consider the arguments against presidential term limits and then to weigh them in the balance. One argument that's often put is that term limits restrict democratic choice, the choice of citizens. If a president is popular, the voters would welcome the president having another term. That may be right, although how you work out whether the president is that popular or what the voters actually want before an election is held is not so easy. But that is an argument that is frequently put. Second argument, and I think this is quite an interesting one because we can see it in action in presidential systems around the world. Term limits affect the accountability and responsiveness of a president, at least during his or her final term. We see that in every second term American president, for example. In that second term, oh, it's a lame duck president, don't expect that person to do anything. I mean, clearly that's a syndrome that needs to be taken into account and managed. A third argument, which you sometimes find in Latin American presidential systems, one that focuses on the rights of the candidate. Term limits restrict the right of an incumbent president to run for office, or term limits deny presidents the equal protection of the law. And we've seen these arguments run successfully in places like Bolivia and Nicaragua in recent times. Term limits may waste leadership talent. Term limits may inhibit longer-term planning. And so that there are those arguments, and we need to think about them. But both the literature on presidential systems and term limits and practical experience looking at how presidential systems work around the world suggests that whatever's the strength of these arguments, they don't outweigh the arguments in favour of term limits. There's no doubt that the literature and practical experience favours term limits of some kind. So let me just finish up with my last series of points about where this debate fits in some of the recent trends in comparative constitutionalism. And the first trend I want to talk about is globalization. I mean, we all know we live in a globalizing age. The world is becoming interdependent, including in ideas about constitutions. One effect of those is that constitutional standards tend to be drifting closer together. But at the same time, getting a lot of emphasis on the diversity of the world, the reality that the world experiences constitutions differently, and in particular the importance of harvesting the experiences and the ideas come from what's often called the global south or the third world or emerging countries or emerging democracies or whatever the term may be. I find all of those terms different. But the idea that constitutional law is going to be global, then let's really make it global and let's really understand what goes on in countries around the world is important, and it sort of counters the idea of globalization. So I'd be interested in your views about how that plays out in the context of term limits. If we think about how the idea of term limits is spread, we can see a really interesting trajectory. The very idea of term limits, together with the very idea of presidentialism, for that matter, has spread around the world since the end of the 18th century, when the United States drew up its Republican Constitution with a presidential system. And interestingly, the US didn't have term limits in its constitution at that stage. The story is that George Washington just voluntarily limited himself to 2 terms, and they didn't finally move to a formal 2-term system until the 1950s. And what that tells you is that all the presidents from the beginning up until the middle of the 20th century voluntarily went for 2-year terms because they thought that was the right thing to do. And that's, I think, a useful insight as well. Nowadays, in the early 21st century, we're very often told that term limits are an international norm, they represent international best practice, and that may well be so, although as we've seen that the practice is the actual practice, if you look at the written constitutions, can be variable. But I think that rather than sort of running on, what's the international norm, it may be more useful for us to try and drill down into what are the actual reasons for term limits, and what are the actual reasons against them. How do we think they operate in our context? And that's really what I've been trying to do in my remarks here today. The second trend that I want to take you to is the trend towards regionalism. It's another very interesting development in the world in which we live. We're seeing states of the world. Of course, they also operate on an international plane, but they are increasingly being organised in regions. And those regions have varying degrees of integration. Highly integrated in parts of Europe, moderately integrated in Africa and Latin America, and the Asia-Pacific region is something of an exception. yes, we have ASEAN, but only for part of the region, and that's not an integrated system. Now, we also see, if we think about the regions of the world, that presidential systems, and so experience with term limits, also vary between regions. So there are concentrations of presidential systems in Africa and Latin America. That's where a large number of them are found in large numbers. Relatively few full presidential systems in Europe. A lot of semi-presidentialism in Europe, where term limits are also used, but not the full-on presidential systems to the same degree. And presidential systems scattered, but mixed with a lot of parliamentary systems in Asia and the Pacific. So let's just think about Africa and Latin America, because in those regions, regional and sub-regional organisations have developed norms and practices to try and encourage the use of term limits and compliance with term limits. Term limits are a big issue in those regions of the world. They're a big issue in Europe as well, where the Council of Europe certainly favours term limits very strongly. But as I said earlier, they have less full-blown presidential systems also than these other regions. Now, it's interesting to see the experience with regionalism in Africa and Latin America. While the regional organisations favour term limits, their statements are sometimes a bit equivocal. And what's the reason for that? Because their member states are not always in agreement, or they're not always in agreement all the time. You'll have a member state with a sort of a rogue president who decides that he or she wants to keep going in office, and then that waters down the statement that the regional organisation is prepared to make. But nevertheless, you find these regional organisations becoming more and more insistent, developing new forms of sanctions on their members who depart from term limits. And you find some quite nice statements about the importance of the underlying importance of term limits. So the one I have here on the slide, for example, constitutions shall not be manipulated so as to hold on to power against the will of the people. And that's one way of describing what's going on with term limits in the African context. And the last trend I want to mention is judicialization, and we were talking about that a little bit before the session began as well. So let me explain where this fits in. Courts play a significant role in a democratic constitutional system. We all know that. And we also know, and it's trite, that the role of courts has had a tendency to expand in recent decades, both generally, although still within parameters that are locally going to be accepted. So the Constitutional Court of Indonesia, for example, probably does all sorts of things that wouldn't be acceptable in the Australian court and vice versa. But courts adapt to the context in which they work. Now, part of this story is that courts are beginning to play a role in controlling the outer boundaries of constitutional change in ways that may have a bearing on term limits. Most obviously, if you have a constitution that has term limits and provides that the term limits are unamendable, as in the Central African Republic, the court will enforce those provisions, as you would hope, as you would expect. But less obviously, even in the absence of a clause like that, an eternity clause of that kind, a court might find that term limits are beyond the basic structure of the Constitution. In other words, what the court's doing in that situation is saying that there are some implied limits on what you can do with the power of constitutional change. Those implied limits relate to democracy and so on. And so it's not a big stretch from that to imagine how changes to affect term limits might be found to be beyond the power of amendment. Now, this is an adaptation of the Indian doctrine of that every constitution has a basic structure, which the constitutional amendment process can't change. And to take that argument one step further, in the Central African Republic, a recent decision of their constitutional court also found that the president lacked power even to initiate the making of a new constitution without terms in order to avoid the restrictions on amendment in the current constitution. So in other words, in that country, you have a constitution that says the president has two terms. After that, the president can't run for office again. The term limits provision is not amendable. The president wants to run for another term, so he says, well, we'll scrap this constitution and we'll make a new one. I'll invoke the constituent power. That went to the Constitutional Court. And the Constitutional Court said you can't do that either. All you're trying to do is to circumvent democracy. Now, I just saw a reference to this case just before I came here to Indonesia, and I thought, oh, that's a good one to mention to people, because you can just see how this trajectory is developing in the courts. Now, it's horses for courses. Not every constitutional court's going to do that, but it's an interesting development. So, in a long spiel from me, I'm sorry. Thanks for the invitation to speak. I'm very interested to have made contact with your centre, and what I say here on the screen is that we also have a centre for comparative constitutional studies, as you know, at the University of Melbourne, and it would be great to have some more interaction with the organization. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for your insightful presentation. Yes, since we have limited time, I directly go to the second speakers, to Bang Ferry Ansari. Bang Ferry, maybe you can explain what should we anticipate in this division of Indonesia.
Thank you, Ninis, Prof. Saunders, Mas Giri, the audience in this room, also online. Thank you for having me discussing about very important issue regarding constitutional law. Yeah, when we discussing about presidential system, we need to going back to the original perspective on American constitutional law, because that's, I think, the most important we need to explain in this issue. After the colonialization, America, especially the founding fathers, there is no founding mothers in America, quite different with us. We do have founding father and mothers. They discuss about to find another system beside British system. So they choose presidential system. But most of the experts in American presidential system mention that kind of system also have another meaning. The meaning is, this is the system where actually the president is the king with limitation of power. So that's the idea. So I think the red line on this issue is the limitation of power. One of the limitation is the term and the tenure of the president. If we read one book, very important book, coming from Carl Frederick Strong, who explained how powerful president is, he mentioned about 5 powers of the president. The power of executive, on legislative, on judiciary. That's why they can appoint the justice and the judge, and also diplomatic power and the security and defense power. Quite powerful, by the way. But there is a limitation. Even though a president has a very powerful authorities, they cannot abuse that power, because someday they will coming to the end of his or her office. So he or she needs to consider that things. And Professor Saunders already mentioned about the historical background in America. And I do believe also there is a temptation for each president to what do we say, to continue their power. Even though President Washington, he actually realized the idea only 1/3, but the supporters of him, I will say, coming, we need you 1/3, because this is a new country, there is a lot of problem, so you need to run one more. And as the history say to us that he ran for 1 month. But when for the 3rd term, he remembered, he mentioned clearly in the Federalist paper that we need a limitation of power. So there is no more one more term for President Washington. And what was happened with President FDR is actually, in my perspective, also politics, not the condition in that time. So he used like the condition, because the World War, to gain like 4 terms in office. Right after that, people realize that we do need to mention the limitation of power, especially the term and the tenure in the Constitution. That's why the 22nd Amendment of American Constitution mentioned clearly about that. So right after that, only 2 terms. And everybody have that temptation. Barack Obama, his supporters asked him for the 3rd term. He just rejected because there is a 22nd Amendment in that time. But I'm not really sure if President Trump win again, and probably he can run for the 3rd term. Let's see. How about Indonesia? Indonesia actually has the same problem. In the beginning, our founding father and mother discussed how important to limit the term and the tenure of the president. But right after President Sukarno, even somebody who also discussed about how important to limit the power, actually he ran like more than 21 years in power. And also MPRS in that time, our Congress declared for president for life to President Sukarno. So he in the office like more than 4 terms, I think, for 21 years. And that also happened to President Suharto. Even though clearly in the Article 7 for our origin constitution, 1945, yeah, that only 2 terms limit for the president, but he tried to interpret it, the article, that he can choose many times if the tenure already ends for 5 years. So in the office, President Suharto like more than 6 terms, yeah, 32 years, more than 32 years. and also that kind of temptation coming to Jokowi, I think. When the supporters coming to Jokowi say, you are the greatest ever president that we have, we need you one more term, and he like, feeling flies because everybody said he is the perfect president ever. So please support me by, collecting other people say that I am the one Indonesia need to the future. So that's why this temptation, for every president will come. What we need to do to respect our constitution. Without that, everybody will, feel he is the correct one to get the third term. So that's why the idea to amend the constitution, to canceling the election, also part of this issue. How Jokowi trapped himself based on the supporters' idea to run again as a president. So I think you will see a lot about this issue from now to 2024. People will discuss a lot about how to give a chance to Jokowi running for the third terms. What civil society do right now is to fight. This will not be happen in our future. I think that's a simple perspective from me, since Professor Sanders will need going soon as possible to the airport. I see the heavy rain over there. That's ruin my mind. We need to give you a chance to going to the airport as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Bang Ferry, for your presentation. Next to Mas Giri, the time is yours.
Thank you, Mbak Anies, for the time. Just want to make a quick presentation with the same reason that Charles needs to go to the airport. Because I saw the rain before. Oh my God, it's going to be traffic jam all over again like yesterday, but hopefully not. But hopefully not, Charles. So I just going to make some observation on how the narrative to push more power for the existing governments or for the current governments done by politicians and their supporters. Much of the theoretical aspect and comparative perspectives already been discussed by Charles and Bang Ferry before. So I'm just going to make some sort of maybe two remarks on what actually happened on the issue of pushing presidential limits. The first one is every politician, they will not get straightforward like, I need more power. I need more power. They will not say loudly that I'm a power-hungry politician. They will not say that. But the things that they are doing is they're creating this kind of grand narrative, a very philosophical, a very good narrative. This is for the common good. This is for the common people. And that narrative is precisely about the things that against the presidential terms that are being exploited. One of the, I remember that Cheryl mentioned against the presidential time limits. It's about it's hampering the longer planning. That's what actually being discussed, being propagated by the supporters of the. They said that Indonesian development, it's there's a discontinue between one president to another president. We cannot be negara maju. We cannot be a first world country if we have this kind of discontinue. So we need to have a consistent planning, consistent program from one president to another president. So that's one argument that being mentioned all over again by the politician. And then that's precisely the problem, because the idea of continuing between one president and another president of the programs is precisely in the context of Indonesian authoritarianism. So before the amendment, the constitution has what we call as a GBHN, state guidelines on state guidelines. So basically, it's a long planning developed by the MPR, the Supreme Assembly in Indonesia, and that's basically their ideas, to have that kind of super bodies that embodied the people's wills, and then the people's that representation then make a planning for 30 or 40 years, and then the president will only act based on that planning. So the idea is that it's very much rooted on the idea of Indonesian authoritarianism. But luckily, Bang Peri and the others challenge the idea of GBHN, the state guidelines. But now it's kind of like become PPHN, right? So they switch the language a bit, but the idea is still the same. They still want to recall the ideas of Indonesians who need to have a plan, planning and a continuing developments. If the current system is not delivering it, that because the president has a term limits. You only have 10 years, while if you want to build the country, you have to maybe like 30 years of continuing planning with a consistent implementation of policies. So that's the kind of observation that I have with the current discussion. So it's not only they want to have more powers, but they really want to bring back the authoritarian ideal back into our constitution, especially the things that what we call it integralistic state. That's one observation that I make. Of course, if you want to implement the integralistic state, you need to like dismantle all the achievement that we have after the amendment. So you need to like change the Article 1. You need to give more power to the MPR, and then the president needs to have limitation. So then they can like be like Suharto all over again, that they continue on the name of developments. I'll have to run this country like forever, maybe. That's what Suharto did in 1965, in 1950s until mid 1955. So to wrap up, I think the things that we also need to be aware about the issue is not to like commenting or fighting against third presidential longer term for the presidents or PPHN or GBHN, but we also need to tackle the idea of integralistic state in the collective memory or political memories in Indonesia. So I think Bang Peri and then all of the constitutional scholars needs to denounce the idea of integralistic states, and it needs to be removed as undemocratic. It's come from fascist Germany, fascist ideas, not really actually regional ideas of Indonesia. It's transmitted by the Japanese fascists to our ideas through Supomo and so forth and so forth. That's how kind of level of discussion need to be elevated, not only talk about one issue per issues. I think that's what I can contribute today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mas Giri and Professor and Bang Ferry. Now we are going to have a question and answer session. If there's any question here for the participant in Jentera or in Zoom, I see that there is a chat there, but I cannot read it clearly. If there's anyone can help me, if there's anyone in Zoom that. Okay, yes, I can back.
When the political in Indonesia discuss about this issue, is the meaning that this issue have a probable the practice in Indonesia? Am I right? And how this position about this issue to practice in Indonesia if this happens? I read it as it is. I think it's about the probability it happens in Indonesia.
This is actually is not Indonesian problem only. It is also coming. You mentioned about Vladimir Putin. He actually very vigorously to check everything, and now Erdogan, also almost in Philippines with Duterte, and based on Indonesia experience, when the politician, join everything all together, what they cannot do, they also can do to impeach the justice in the constitutional court without any kind of reason. So as long as they, see the people cannot or want to do something to protect the constitution itself, they will see this is a chance to do something politically. Even change the term and the tenure of the president. Remember, if there is no complaint from PDIP, the majority of political party in the House, probably the agenda of President Jokowi to change the term and the tenure will be happened already. If we remember the situation in the parliament in that time, if there is no complaint at all, probably we will see again Jokowi in 2024. And this will be another task for Mbak Titi to fight against Jokowi. If she win, that will be good for Indonesia. If she not win, that will be, I think, horrible. That's why we can see the condition right now in Indonesian politics, the way Jokowi's administration to provide everything to the politician, especially about this entity, I think quite similar with New Order regime when Suharto giving something to all those entities who support his power. So I think we need to do something to remind the politician that they cannot do something else that Constitution doesn't mention. So this is important. When we run this country, we should run this country by using the Constitution, not other things, not by saying Jokowi is the only one can save Indonesia. We do have like 20 million people, 200 million people. So it's quite strange if only Jokowi, the one and only, can save this country. There is a Ferry Amsari over here. Yeah, there's a lot of young people, Mbak Titi, Mbak Asvin, a lot of people in East Indonesia never has a chance to be something else, yeah, like Indonesian president. Why we don't give a chance to do something in the future? So that's it, I think.
Okay, I think the possibility is quite far, but it's more probable. The things that we need to do, it's actually we need to focus on what we need to do to prevent that from happening. One of the arguments that I put forward in my short presentation before is that we need to deconstruct the good narrative about continuing development and so forth. It's not about that. It's just about a politician who wants more power, who wants to sit in powers longer than they should. It's about a politician who wants to accumulate wealth and powers. It's all about that. And the Constitution has a mechanism to prevent that. That is, the president cannot be elected for 2 times. So I think it's some things that we need to understand, that it's not about doing good for the countries, but it's actually accumulating powers, accumulating wealth for the supporters or for the politicians in favoring for one more time for the presidency. That's all about it, and we need to set against that ideas by saying that our constitutions at the time currently is probably the optimal. I'm not going to say that it's the best, but it's the optimal constitution that we have at the time. It's not meant to be amendment in time. Maybe that's the.
I think both of those sets of observations were terrific. And can I just come back to the question about this not just being Indonesia, which of course is true. You could tell from what I said earlier about the regions. There's lots of pressure in both Latin America and Africa from presidents to extend their term for all the reasons that have just been given. It's very tempting. And I was thinking as you were both talking, these arguments don't just apply to presidents of countries. I mean, I was once the president of an international association, and I thought I was pretty good. And as the end of my term arrived, people said, maybe you should run for another one. I did do quite well. And then you resist temptation. But we all have that. You know, we all do something and we think we've done it okay. And you're tempted to put your hat in the ring again, even when it's against the rules. But one of the interesting things from experiences, particularly in Latin America, is that sometimes presidents can set up the argument for another term, not just through the development argument, although you can see how tempting that is and is going to be in the world that's coming. But you know, sometimes they run a referendum and they win the referendum, and then, or sometimes they get a favourable court decision, and once you get some sort of legitimising factor coming in, then it becomes even more complicated to deal with the argument. So I think to start running the argument about the importance of complying with the Constitution and the arguments in favour not being strong, I think is prudent.
What time you are going to leave? Maximum? Soon. Okay, Mas Adi? Okay, we still have 28 minutes. Is that okay? Okay, talking about Bang Ferry and Mas Giri said in Indonesia there is also impacted by the formulation of the coalition in the government, because right now the president is like opening the door for any political parties, anyone who wants to join the coalition. We have around 80% of the coalition, government coalition. So there is only two political parties that is not in the coalition. And as all of you said, that being in the coalition is also tempting, because they get materials and so on and so on. And we are last year, I think we are very surprised when 2 or 3 member of the party coalition said Jokowi's term should be we should have more terms for Joko Widodo. And my question, Professor, in the global perspective, how is the formulation of the coalition also impacted in the adding more the terms for the president? I mean, the role of the political parties. Ferry Amsari said we are relatively not to really worry, because the major political party, PDIP, even though PDIP is the majority party in Indonesia, where Joko Widodo comes from, is against this idea. But there is also a role of political party in raising this issue.
Yeah, I agree. Interestingly, before I came here today, we were having a discussion about the political parties in Indonesia and how decision-making is centralized at the top. So you can have that sort of deal that you're just describing, which even in other countries, even though the membership of political parties is dropping, it'd be pretty hard to do that, because the members have a view about whether you should be in coalition and who you should be in coalition with. And then that becomes complicated when an election comes around. So I do think that the coalition arrangements are definitely having an impact. And if underlying that is the structure of political parties, then that's another issue. And there are all sorts of questions there about how do you get the people to actually engage with politics instead of just, voting for whoever they voted for last time in the election. I mean, interestingly, one of the actual reason I'm in Indonesia for these 2 days is to launch a paper that my centre wrote with International Idea on the role of oppositions in parliaments. And the actual topic of the paper was oppositions in legislatures in pandemics, because the perception had been, correctly so, that during the pandemic, parliaments across the world were affected and therefore oppositions. But interestingly, in writing that, before we got to the problem of the pandemic, we had to think about the problem of the opposition and articulate the role of an opposition in a parliament, in a legislature, because we were writing it to try to apply to legislatures, whether they were parliamentary or presidential. And of course, the whole idea of the opposition varies between those. But we came up with saying 3 things. On any sort of democratic legislature, whatever the system, the opposition, important, critically for democracy, does 3 things. 1, opposition members represent people. They represent a segment of the people. 2, as members of a legislature, they are obliged to hold the government to account, to make sure things are transparent, known, mistakes are pointed out publicly, etc., etc. Now, all members of parliament do that, but opposition members critically do it, and they're much more likely to scrutinise government behaviour more carefully than people in the governing party or the governing coalition, whatever that might be. And 3, even in a presidential system, the opposition members of a Congress need to present themselves as an alternative. We are an alternative way forward here. We have alternative plans. That's our justification for being here. And all three of those things are important, I think, in a democracy. And the more you whittle away the idea of opposition here and people sort of go into coalition, then the more complicated it is and the more problematic it is for the democracy. There's one country in the world that places less importance on all of this because it's more consensual, and that's Switzerland. They have a very consensual style of politics. When after an election they draw on members from different parties to form the government. All that sounds lovely. However, Switzerland has a different check and balance. They have a system whereby the public can initiate a process to overturn any piece of legislation passed by the Swiss Parliament. And they do it on a regular basis. They also have a system whereby the people themselves can initiate constitutional change and put policies that they want into the Constitution. I mean, that's a real live system. They have 4 referendum votes a year and they have a regular practice of voting yes. So that's a system with a consensual style, but a check and balance of a different kind. And that's not Indonesia. I'm not suggesting you go down that path. I'm just saying, you know, if you're going to have consensual style, then you've got to think, well, what's the counter to that in order to prevent power being inappropriately accumulated?
Can I respond a little bit on that? It looks in Switzerland, it looks similar with California democracy a little bit, is it? No different.
Well,
how can we differ?
They're similar in that they both have referendums, but they're completely different in their approach to government. So the Swiss, nothing consensual about Californian government. It's all sort of rough and tumble and adversarial. The Swiss are genuinely consensual, and there's a very interesting interrelationship between the way in which their representative democracy works and the direct democracy system works. So if you know, you the Swiss, in a very developed country, of course, but with a long habit of getting together with the other parties, if you know that if you stray against public opinion in any significant way, somebody's going to mount an initiative to overturn your law, you're going to keep an eye on public opinion. Whereas the Californian thing's more of an add-on to what's already an adversarial system of government.
Okay, is there any more question here or in the Zoom because the screen is off? No more question in here in this room? Anyone? Perfect. Okay. No one. Okay, since no one is going to ask more question, I think I'm going to finish this discussion. I'm not going to conclude this discussion because I think the 3 of the speakers already give an insightful presentation about the comparison, about not only the word comparison, but the professor also compare about the parliamentary system and also presidential system, and also Bang Ferry and Mas Giri also give more perspective in Indonesia that this issue is, I think, still raising until 2024 election. So it is the role for the civil society and also academic to make sure that we have to defend our democracy. Since I think in the region, I mean in the Southeast Asia, I think now only Indonesia is still categorized as democracy compared to another country in Southeast Asia. Okay, thank you everyone for coming here. And if anyone who is late for the discussion, this discussion is live streamed in Jentera or PUSaKO, in the PUSaKO YouTube, so you can rewatch the discussion on the YouTube of the PUSaKO. Thank you and good afternoon.
Recording stopped.